Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the 21 podcast, telling the story of the Birmingham Pub Bombings and the campaign to get justice for those who died on that fateful night in November 1974. This time, proposals by the Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis for what would effectively be an amnesty for all those involved in violence during the Troubles. Mr. Lewis is calling for a statute of limitations that would, in the words of Boris Johnson, allow Northern Ireland to draw a line under the past. It would also, rather conveniently for the government, halt politically unpopular prosecutions of British troops accused of killing unarmed civilians. The people responsible for the deaths of 21 innocent victims in Birmingham, who were just out meeting friends, having a drink in the tavern in the town and the mulberry bush, would also have the threat of prosecution removed. Julie Hambleton from the Justice for the 21 campaign gave me her reaction.
We've been aware of this proposal legislation for some years because the whole premise of it is based on the so-called prosecution of soldiers, which is actually a sprat to catch a mackerel. It's got nothing to do with protecting the soldiers. It is all to do with the British state looking to protect themselves and to keep their dirty, toxic secrets well and truly buried forever, which is what this legislation will allow them to do, which no other legislation before will have had the power to do.
You say that the issue of the soldiers is a sprat to catch a mackerel, but it seems that this has brought this issue to the fore in the eyes of the British government, the possibility that British troops might be prosecuted for their possible criminal acts during the Troubles.
Yes, because that is how the government have put it out there. They created a situation where if the soldiers were to face prosecution, it would create uproar across the United Kingdom, across the public arena, which is exactly what it did. And that was their premise all along. Now, I am not in any way saying that any soldiers should be immune from prosecution, because if a soldier went above and beyond his duties and did something that was a criminal act, then she should face prosecution like anybody else. It's as simple as that. However, the premise of it, the core basis of it, was using the soldiers as a way for the government to slide in under our noses, especially at the moment where COVID is the perfect excuse to bury bad news. They've used soldiers as an excuse to bring in this legislation that will also cover the paramilitaries like the IRA, for them to be let off, because obviously the argument would always be, well, if you're going to offer immunity to your soldiers, then you've got to offer immunity to our soldiers. But obviously the IRA were not soldiers, they were psychopaths. They were not wearing a uniform. The only uniform they wore was a balaclava because they didn't have the guts to even show their face. That's how much courage of their convictions they had. So the legislation itself is no deterrent. How can any government in Western society that claims to be democratic try and implement a legislation that is actually making mass murder legal? Because what they're actually saying is, for any future potential terrorist organisation, of which there are many just lying in the wings and biding their time, rest assured, they can kill with impunity without any fear of retribution. And as long as they say, oh, well, we murdered, it doesn't matter how many people they kill, doesn't matter how many thousands they kill, how many they leave with life-changing injuries, because as long as they say, oh, we did it for political reasons, don't worry, because the British government will let us off and they give us immunity in years to come because we've made it as a political statement. Are you happy for your children to live in a country where they allow mass murderers to walk free based on this legislation?
The political parties in Northern Ireland, Sinn Féin and the DUP, have spoken out against this as well.
Yes, but they haven't spoken out about it with any great fervour, have they? They haven't gone to the ends of the earth, like they have about for Sinn Féin, the Irish Language Act, and for the DUP, like the invisible border down the middle of the water between us and Northern Ireland. There's no further in their argument. And you know why there's no further in their argument? Is because they too want this buried. They too want this buried because they have also been party to the political eruptions that have been taking place over the years, where the British state colluded with PIRA and loyalists as a way to infiltrate them, which has become common knowledge now, to the point where it will help the MLAs, the equivalent of our MPs in Northern Ireland, to not have to deal with the past, because they will either know someone or be related to someone who was quite possibly involved in the trouble. So it helps them to keep their history, or those that they know's history, well and truly buried. But that does not bring peace or any kind of settlement to the families who continue to grieve and continue to fight for truth and justice. There will never be peace, and there will never be any kind of reconciliation until those who are in a position to do something actually have the guts to enforce the laws that they have implemented. We don't need this new legislation. And where we're concerned with the Birmingham Pub Bombings, we're not part of the Good Friday Agreement. We don't fall under that legislation. But the British government are looking to bring us in to this new legislation, but we weren't good enough for it in 1998. So why are they bringing us into a brand new piece of legislation if it's not to keep their dirty, toxic secrets well and truly buried?
So you think that the government has been waiting for this moment, using the possible prosecutions of British soldiers as a cover for a much more sinister operation to hide the reality of its actions in Northern Ireland during the Troubles?
Absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. What your listeners need to understand is this. During the Troubles, just its title, why is it known as the Troubles? Why is it not known as the Civil War or War? And I'll tell you why. Because the British government were at pains to ensure that it never became known as a civil war for two reasons. The first one was they didn't want to lose face on the international platform around the world, because the United Kingdom is renowned allegedly for its introduction of democracy across the world, or across to Western society. And by having a civil war, it would deface and underestimate our position across the world. The second reason they didn't want it to be classed as a civil war is purely on monetary terms. Because if it was classed as a civil war, any damage that was done to any building, the owners could not claim insurance off that damage. They don't care, and successive governments have proved this point. They have no wit about the value of the thousands of lives that were taken during the Troubles. To them, they were collateral damage. Well, my sister and the other 20 victims of the Birmingham Pub Bombings were not collateral damage. They were living, breathing, loving human beings who had their whole lives robbed from underneath them, quite literally, where we have missed out on their lives and their potential production of other lives, where my sister, where Jane Davis, Pamela Palmer, and so many others could have had children of their own, could have had grandchildren. Last Wednesday would have been Maxine's 65th birthday. She could have been heading for retirement. She could have been storming forward as a lawyer, helping people less fortunate. But that opportunity was taken away from my sister and from 20 other people. And that is why we fight, is because we are their voice, because we cannot depend upon anyone in government of any party to jump to their defence. Because if we did and we could, then campaigns like ours would not exist.
There will be people on both sides of the Irish Sea saying this is an opportunity to draw a line under these terrible events of the past, for Northern Ireland in particular, to move forward with a different sense of itself than has been the case in the past. I can tell from the way you're talking, Julie, that those kind of conversations would have no place in your house. You want justice for your sister and all the other victims of the Birmingham pub bombings. Under the law of the land, they were murdered. And yet it seems that their murder as innocent people is not considered to be as important as the murder of other people.
Well, they're not even that. With this legislation proposal, they don't exist. It's as simple as that. This legislation is quite literally wiping out that they even existed. Who wants to live in a country that does that to their own citizens?
Julie Hambleton, I'm Adrian Goldberg, and you've been listening to the 21 podcast.